Hello, everybody. Today we are going to be talking about my favorite books of the year. I usually don't do these, but I decided that I would this year. I'm going to do dedicated videos to all of my favorite reads and my least favorite reads of the whole year. As with, I think, everybody who does these are not books that are published in 2019. These are just out of all the books that I read in 2019. These are my favorite ones. I did not rank these, although I do think I have two that are my top favorites, and I will save those for last. But otherwise, this isn't really in any particular order. I believe that for both my lists, my favorite and my least favorites, when I was narrowing it down to my choices, I ended up with 11 for both. It just kind of worked out that way, that there were 11 books for my favorites and my least favorites. I felt like I had narrowed it down enough that everything was kind of on par, and there wasn't one that I could kind of shave off that I felt like was particularly better or worse than the others. So I just decided to leave it at 11. As it has been established, I did have kind of a mildly disappointing year of reading in 2019. I didn't really have any like 5-star books that I felt like really changed me and completely grabbed hold of my heart, but that's not to say that I didn't read anything good. I did read a lot of great books, so these are some of my favorites. The first one we're going to start out with is Patron Saints of Nothing by Brandi Kolbert. I read this at the end of the year, and so I did wrap this up pretty recently, but this is a YA contemporary about a boy who travels back to the Philippines to stay with his extended family, and he's kind of investigating the death of his cousin that has been kind of mysterious. I loved this book because I loved diving into this boy's Filipino culture. I love that this book taught me a lot about historical events and current events in the Philippines. I thought this was a really powerful piece of fiction. It was super compelling. It was so fascinating from start to finish. I really, really loved everything that was going on in this book. It just felt like one of the more powerful and important YA contemporaries that I've read in a long time, and I just really, really recommend this to everyone. I think it was so worth the read, and I really feel like I gained a lot from this book, and I just like really want other people to read it as well. I thought it was just fantastic. Absolutely loved it. For the next one, why don't we go with a book that's actually a little bit similar. It's a book that I read at the beginning of the year, and it is Darice the Great Is Not Okay by Adib Khorram. This is another YA contemporary about a teenage boy who is from the United States, but he travels back to visit extended family. Not the Philippines this time. He goes to Iran and stays with his mom's half of the family. So he's half Persian, and this book is really about him kind of learning and connecting to his Persian family and identity. It is a really quietly powerful and like very subtly moving YA contemporary, and I just really loved that. It's very tender and just sweet and beautiful. This book also deals a lot with mental illness. I really liked seeing the way that those themes were handled. And again, this is just a YA contemporary that I just would so highly recommend to everybody. I loved seeing this character connecting to his culture. It was really heartwarming and just like delicately sad at the same time, and I really love that about this book. Next up is The Skull of Truth by Bruce Coville. So I read the Magic Shop series by Bruce Coville this year, and I had read some of the books before, but not all of them, and I really, really enjoyed this reading experience of diving back into this book series from my childhood, but also getting to discover new books in the series. And this was one of the books that was new to me, and it just really blew me away. I was really surprised by like the depth and intensity of some of the issues that were tackled in this book, and I really, really was just like so emotionally moved by the end of it. It was really, really good. At the same time though, this book was also so funny and just like a delight to read, and I wanted to put it on my favorites list to kind of represent Bruce Coville as a whole. He was a highlight of my reading year in 2019, so I would recommend this series to everyone, but this one in particular was just like the best one in my opinion. It was It was so good. I felt like this book did a good job of like representing the emotional highs and the emotional lows that you can get throughout this series. And it had all of the aspects of this series that are really interesting and really well done. Like they all just worked in this book. Next up is a series. So I guess technically I have 12 books on my list, but I just kind of combined these 2 books into one. They are the Heartstopper books by Alice Oseman. This is a graphic novel series. It's a webcomic, so you can read it all online. That's what I did. They are now published as actual books. That's why I kind of counted them as like books I read this year. But anyway, these comics follow 2 side characters from Alice Oseman's book Solitaire, and it is the story of Nick and Charlie, how they meet, how they become friends, how their relationship becomes something other than friends. It's just so cute. I love how earnest and charming and just like wholly adorable this series is. The way that Alice Oseman like draws her characters, like their facial expressions and just everything about it is just so heartwarming. Like truly, I don't know how you could read this comic series and not just experience pure joy throughout it. It's so sweet and just like truly it makes you so happy reading this. I tend not to really gravitate toward romance in general, but this is like a relationship that I just so root for and care about because it's just so pure, and you just love these 2 characters so much. And they are like in high school, so it has a really youthful energy to it. It feels like such a privilege to watch them grow. And I really love that the friendship group in this book series is pretty much all consisting of queer characters, and it's just so wholesome. Please read this comic, it's just so good. I do have one other graphic novel on this list, so let's do that one next, and it is Nancy Drew and the Palace of Wisdom by Kelly Thompson, Jen St. Ong, Triona Farrell, and Ariana Maher. So this is like a new reboot of Nancy Drew. It follows Nancy, and she is kind of reconnecting with all of her friends, the Hardy Boys, Bess and George, and they are solving a mystery together. And I just found this to be utterly delightful. I am a huge Nancy Drew fan, and I thought that this was such a good modern take on Nancy Drew. It felt really fresh. It felt very smart and entertaining and relatable and funny. And I just really particularly loved this because I really liked the way that all of the characters were depicted. I have seen so many different iterations of Nancy Drew at this point, and I feel like the personalities and the way that the characters looked, everything was captured really well. I feel like the way that these classic characters were translated to the setting and tone that the graphic novel was going for was really flawlessly executed, and I just felt like this comic really got the way that I see the characters. It's exactly the type of like drawing style and color palette that I really enjoy when I'm reading a graphic novel. All in all, I just thought this was so good. Within the past couple of years, there's been a ton of new Nancy Drew content, and I am just living for this resurgence of Nancy Drew. This is definitely one of my favorite versions of Nancy Drew I've seen in a while. I loved it. Next up, we've got some more YA contemporary fiction, because you all know that I love YA contemporary fiction. So let's talk about the new Brandi Kolbert book. Another thing we all know, I love Brandi Kolbert, and she published a book in 2019 called The Revolution of Bertie Randolph. It had everything that I love about Brandi Kolbert. She's super respectful of serious topics, but she never turns it into like a cheesy, preachy sort of thing. Everything that she writes about feels really genuine, and you can connect to it really well. I just feel very safe in her hands. She just is very responsible and skillful in the way that she writes. I also just really like the characters and worlds that she creates. I love that she writes slice of life style contemporaries, because that is just something I absolutely love. She just does such a great job with every book that she writes, and this was no exception. This was super strong YA contemporary, and I loved it. Next up, we have Tell Me Something Real by Kala Devlin, which Actually takes place in the 70s, but it basically reads like a contemporary, and it follows this family and the illness of their mother. I put this book on my list of favorites of the year because it truly took me by surprise. I read it with absolutely no expectations. I didn't know anything about it going into it. I hadn't heard about anybody reading it. I had no like recommendation that had hyped me up on this book whatsoever. And it was so good. I completely fell in love with the writing style. I really fell in love with the story. This book deals with grief, kind of, like in a way that I have never really seen written about before. And it was really fascinating and I loved it. I thought it was so emotional. The characters go through things in this book that are super complicated. And so the emotional responses and the way that they deal with these things are also super complicated. I just thought it was really interesting to read about this. I still haven't really seen anybody talking about this book. It's one that I feel like hasn't really been on anybody else's radar, but I would highly recommend it. I would be so fascinated to see other people reading this book because I definitely could see how this might rub some people the wrong way, but it really worked for me. It was such a good surprise. It's one of those books that you pick up with no inclination about what it's going to be like, and it just really like restores your faith in reading. It like rekindles your love of books. It was one of those experiences for me where it just totally worked for me, and it made me feel so grateful for it because of that experience. Next up, we have a book that I feel like is probably on a lot of people's favorites of the year. I definitely see people talking about this book quite often. It is Sadie by Courtney Summers. Please read trigger warnings for this book before going into it because it is just like very visceral, very emotional. But I think that is why this book stuck with me. I read it at the beginning of the year and I have not been able to stop thinking about it. And because I've seen so many different people talking about this book and reviewing it, I feel like I have appreciated it more and more as time goes on because people will bring up things about this book that I didn't even pick up on when I read it. There's so much going on in this book that is really, really well done. It is an absolute punch to the gut. It's just so much to deal with, but it is incredible. I'm extremely impressed by this book. I thought it was just absolutely stunning. On a lighter note, the next book that I wanted to talk about is The Vanishing Star by Maureen Johnson. This, of course, is the second book in the Truly Devious series. I've been talking a lot about this series over the past couple years because new Maureen Johnson books are pretty much the most exciting thing in the world to me. There is really no other author that I will get hyped for in the way that I will for Maureen Johnson. This is a mystery series, and I was really afraid that the second book in the series wasn't going to give me any answers. It was just going to kind of slide in as like a buffer in between the first book and the last book. But that was not the case with this. I felt like we got so many answers, so much plot was covered. I really, really got more and more immersed with the mystery of this series. I fell in love with the characters even more. I thought it was a fantastic second novel to this series. I love Maureen Johnson. This book made me incredibly happy. It was my most highly anticipated book of 2019, and it did not disappoint. I loved it. And I still haven't read the third one yet. It is out now, but I'm going to reread the first two books again and then go into the third one because I just want an excuse to reread them again. But also, I had such a good experience rereading the first one and then going into the second one. I feel like it's going to be a good time to read the first, second, and third all together. So I'm really excited to be doing that probably next month. And that brings us to my last two books that are, I think these are like my top two actual favorite books of the year. First one I'm going to talk about is How It Feels to Float by Helena Fox. This is another one I read pretty recently, so I did just wrap this book up. It is a YA contemporary. It takes place in Australia. It deals with grief and mental illness and friendship. And it was just so up my alley, and it was just so perfect for me. I loved the way that this was written. It was poetic and weird. So many different layers of emotion are just packed into this book. I love me an emotional read. I really felt for the main character in this book, and she just has so many different things in her life going on that I really strongly connected to. This book was strange in so many good ways. It was interesting in so many ways that appealed to me. I just feel like this book, out of all of these books I've read, it was fiction that worked for me in a way that was just so personal and so perfect. And that's why I'm putting it at like the top of my favorite fiction reads of this year. It was perfect. I loved it. And that brings us to the last book on my list that I think I'm going to definitively say is my favorite book of 2019, and that is Educated by Tara Westover. This is a memoir that is extremely popular, so you probably have heard of it or read it. If you haven't read it, the hype is real. This book is so good. And the reason that I put this as my favorite book of the year is because this has become like my go-to recommendation. When anybody asks me for a book recommendation, I'm like, Educated by Tara Westover. I have made multiple people purchase this book and read this book. It has to be my favorite book of the year because I will not stop talking about it to people. This story just blew my mind. It was bizarre and utterly fascinating, and I just was completely blown away by the events of this book. Like, it was just absolutely wild, and I thought that, like, plot wise, like what happens in this book on its own, I was so riveted by the goings on in this book. But that's honestly like not even what makes this book great. What makes this book great is that Tara Westover is an incredibly skilled writer. Her prose is just like so well written and it's so good. I loved the way that she crafted sentences. I loved the way that she wrote her thoughts out in this book. And I love that she had an interesting story to tell, and she told it in a way that was purposeful and meaningful. I really feel like there's so much that you can gain from this book by going on this journey with her, because she learns so much throughout her life. Her opinions about things change, and like her growth as a person is such like a valuable journey to go on alongside her. And I just really appreciated being able to do that. And I really feel like that she has so many important things to say and like to teach people through her life experiences. I just feel like this book was so readable and like accessible, and it's going to be a really fascinating read for everybody. But at the same time, there are so many intellectual like levels to this book, and there's so many themes and interesting content in here that you can really like do a deep dive into. I think that's why I recommend it to so many people, because I feel like at like on a baseline level, everybody is going to enjoy reading this because it's just super fascinating. But then there are so many different things you can talk about that come up through this book. So I feel like everybody reading it is going to be able to find something interesting, and I feel like everybody is going to have a different conversation around this book. I actually really want to reread this book and see if I give it 5 stars upon reread, because like I said, like I read this at the beginning of the year and I will not shut up about it. So I feel like at this point, I have really developed a stronger love and appreciation for this book than when I initially finished it. And I gave it like a really strong 4.5 stars. So I feel like this actually could be a 5-star read if I were to reread it. And I kind of want to find out, because I don't want to force it, but it would make me very happy if I did have at least one 5-star read of the year. And my bets would be on this one being that book. But regardless, I loved this either way. And of course, I recommend this to literally everyone. So if you haven't read this, like, please read this book. It's so good. That was my favorite book of the year. I wouldn't have expected a nonfiction book to be my favorite book of the year, but this was just a memoir that completely blew all the other books out of the water. It was so good. So yeah, I think that's pretty much it. That's all I have to say. Those were my favorite books of 2019. I would love to know if you read any of these books in 2019, if they were also favorites of yours, or if you didn't like them as much as I did. I'd love to know why. But I hope you enjoyed this, and I hope you pick up at least one of these on my recommendation. That would be a dream come true. Thank you very much for watching. I'll see you guys soon. Bye.